My name is Ava Carter. I'm 32 years old, and for the past 4 years, I worked a job my own sister never took seriously. She used to call it my little side thing. Said it wasn't stable, said I'd come running back to her when it failed. At every family dinner, she made sure everyone heard it. "How's your tiny job going?" She'd ask with a smile. People laughed. I didn't argue. I didn't explain, I just smiled. And stayed quiet because I knew something she did in single quotes. 3 weeks ago, I was sitting in my office reviewing applications for a new position, when one resume made my fingers stop. The name felt familiar. To familiar, I read it again. And then the door opened. She walked in, confident, dressed perfectly, ready for her interview. My sister, she didn't recognize me at first. But the moment she looked up, her expression changed. Her smile faded, her eyes froze. Because the small job she had mocked for years was now the company she was applying to, and I was the one sitting across the table. She tried to speak, but then I picked up her resume, looked straight at her, and said something that made her go completely silent. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Now let's begin. I grew up believing that family meant support. That no matter how different our paths were, we would always stand behind each other. But that belief started to crack the older my sister and I got. Because while I chose a quiet, uncertain path, she chose the kind of life people admire instantly. The kind with visible success, steady income, and constant praise. Her name is Olivia, 2 years older than me. Confident in a way that made people listen. The kind of person who walked into a room and naturally took control of it. While I was always the opposite, quieter, more observant. The one who preferred building something slowly rather than chasing attention. And maybe that was where everything began to shift between us. Because while I was trying to figure things out, she had already decided that I was falling behind. I still remember the first time she laughed at my work. We were sitting at our parents' dining table, the usual Sunday dinner, the table full. Our parents, our uncle, a few cousins. And Olivia had just finished talking about a new project at her company. Something about a major client deal. Everyone was impressed. Our father nodded proudly. Our mother smiled the way she always did when Olivia spoke. And then, without even looking at me directly, she said, "So Ava, are you still doing that little online thing?" Her tone was light, almost playful. But there was something underneath it, something sharp. I looked up from my plate and said calmly, "It's not little. I'm building something." She smiled, that same controlled smile she always had. "Of course you are," she said, taking a sip of her drink. "But does it actually make money yet?" A few people at the table chuckled softly. Not in a cruel way, but enough to make the moment linger. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't respond. I just nodded slightly and continued eating. Because explaining it would have taken too long. And I already knew she wasn't really asking to understand. That became a pattern after that night. Every family gathering turned into a quiet performance. Olivia would talk about promotions, bonuses, new investments, and then, almost like clockwork, she would turn the attention toward me. "Still working from home?" she would ask, or "Must be nice not having a real boss," and every time, I gave the same reaction, a small smile. A short answer, nothing more, because the truth was, I wasn't ready to prove anything yet. What I was building didn't look impressive on the outside. There was no office, no team, no big announcements, just long nights, constant uncertainty, and a belief that I couldn't explain to anyone else, especially not to someone who had already decided it was worthless. My parents didn't say much. They weren't as direct as Olivia, but I could feel their doubt in quieter ways, the questions about stability, the suggestions that I apply for something more secure, something normal, and I understood their concern. I really did, but what hurt wasn't their doubt. It was Olivia's certainty, the way she spoke about my work like it was already a failure. Like the outcome had been decided before I even had a chance to try. Months passed, then a year, and nothing really changed on the surface. Olivia kept rising, her company grew. Her social circle expanded, she started attending events, posting pictures in places I had never been, surrounded by people who looked just as successful as she did. And every time I saw those photos, I felt that quiet pressure again. That question in the back of my mind asking if maybe she was right. If maybe I was wasting my time, but then I would sit back down at my desk, open my laptop and keep working. Because even when things were slow, even when progress felt invisible, there was something about it that felt real to me. Something that kept me going, even when no one else believed in it. Especially during the second year, when things got harder than I expected. There were months when I barely made enough to cover my expenses. Moments when I stared at my screen wondering if I should just give up and apply for a job, like everyone else wanted me to. But every time I got close to that decision, something would happen. A small win, a new client, a project that worked. Just enough to pull me back and remind me why I started. I didn't talk about those moments at family dinners, I kept them to myself. Because I had learned that not every progress needs an audience. And definitely not an audience that is waiting for you to fail. By the third year, things started to shift. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in quiet, steady steps. The kind you only notice if you're the one walking them. My work became more consistent, the income stabilized. Opportunities started coming to me instead of me chasing them. But even then, I didn't say anything, I didn't announce it. I didn't correct Olivia when she made her usual comments. Because at that point, it wasn't about proving her wrong anymore. It was about finishing what I started. And maybe that's why the distance between us grew even more, not because we argued, but because we stopped understanding each other completely. To her, I was still the younger sister with the small job, the one who never quite caught up. And to me, she became someone I observed more than connected with. Someone whose approval I no longer needed, even if a part of me still felt the weight of her words sometimes. And then came the night that changed everything. Another family dinner, same table, same voices. Same pattern. Olivia arrived late, dressed perfectly as always, talking about a new investment deal she had just closed. Everyone listened, impressed, and then, right on cue, she turned to me. "So Ava," she said with that familiar smile, "still building your little project?" There was a pause, just a second. But enough for everyone to look at me, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look down, I didn't rush to answer. I just met her eyes and said, "Yes," calmly, nothing more. She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said. And the table filled with soft laughter again, but this time something felt different. Not in the room, but inside me, because for the first time, her words didn't feel heavy, they didn't sit on my chest the way they used to. They just passed through, like noise. And I realized in that moment that I had stopped needing her to understand. I had stopped waiting for her approval, and more importantly, I had stopped seeing myself the way she saw me. I didn't say anything else that night, I didn't need to. Because something had already shifted. Quietly, completely, and she had no idea. By the beginning of the fourth year, the life I had been quietly building no longer looked small. At least not from where I was standing, but the interesting part was, almost no one outside my work circle knew that. Because I had never announced it, never posted about it, never tried to prove anything to anyone who had already made up their mind, including Olivia, and maybe that was why everything unfolded the way it did. Because while she continued seeing me as someone stuck in the same place, I had already moved far beyond it without making a sound. It started with a single project that performed better than anything I had done before. One client turned into three. Three turned into a steady stream, and before I realized it, I wasn't just working alone anymore. I was managing work, delegating tasks, building systems. Things I used to only imagine. The late nights didn't stop, but they changed. They were no longer filled with doubt, they were filled with decisions, planning, expansion, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think bigger, not just about surviving, but about building something that could stand on its own, something real, something no one could dismiss as a little job within months. I rented a small office space, nothing extravagant, just a clean, quiet place where I could separate work from everything else. I remember standing there the first day, looking at the empty room, feeling that same quiet belief I had held onto from the beginning. Except now it felt heavier, more grounded, like it finally had something to stand on. I didn't tell my family about the office, I didn't invite anyone to see it. Because I wasn't building it for them, I was building it for myself. And maybe that's why when things started growing faster, I stayed just as quiet, new clients, larger contracts, a small team forming around me. People who respected my decisions, who trusted my direction. People who never once asked if my work was real, because to them, it already was. And still, every time I sat at that family table, nothing changed on the surface. Olivia would still talk about her deals, her investments, her network, and then she would turn to me with that same tone, that same casual dismissal, as if time had frozen me in place. "Still working from home?" she asked once, and I simply nodded. Because explaining would have ruined something, not for her, but for me. I wasn't interested in winning conversations anymore. I was interested in building outcomes, and outcomes don't need to be explained. They reveal themselves at the right time. And that time came sooner than I expected. It was a Monday morning. One of those days that felt routine at first. I was in my office, reviewing quarterly numbers. The kind of work that used to feel overwhelming but now felt natural. When my assistant walked in with a folder. "We've shortlisted candidates for the operations manager role," she said. Placing it on my desk, I nodded, thanking her, and continued working for a few minutes before opening the folder. There were several resumes. Each one from candidates with strong backgrounds, experience, qualifications. People who had built careers in structured environments. People like Olivia. I flipped through them one by one, reading carefully, making notes, evaluating, until my hand stopped on one page, not because of the qualifications, but because of the name at the top. Olivia Carter. For a moment, I thought it was a coincidence. A common name, nothing unusual. But as I read further, the details aligned. The work history, the company, everything matched. My chest felt still. Not heavy, not tense, just still. I read the resume again, slower this time, noticing the confidence in the way it was written. The achievements listed, the tone I had heard so many times at dinner. Except now it was on paper, structured, formal. Directed at me without her knowing it. I leaned back in my chair, processing the situation. Out of all the companies she could have applied to, out of all the roles she could have pursued, she had sent her application here, to my company without realizing it, and for the first time in years. I felt something shift in a way I couldn't ignore. Not anger, not satisfaction, but something quieter. Something that felt like timing. Like everything that had been building silently was about to surface. I didn't react immediately. I didn't call her. I didn't remove the application. I simply closed the folder and sat there for a moment, thinking, because this wasn't just a coincidence. It was an intersection to completely different versions of reality about to meet in one place. The version she believed, where I was still struggling, still behind, still working on something insignificant, and the version I had been living, where I was now the one making decisions, reviewing candidates, building something she had unknowingly stepped into. I picked up the folder again and marked her application for interview. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I needed to see how this would unfold. Because part of me wanted to understand what she saw when she walked into a room she believed was above her, and what would happen when that assumption broke. The interview was scheduled for Thursday, 3 days away, and in those 3 days, I didn't tell anyone, not my team, not my family. I continued working as usual, attending meetings, reviewing projects, making decisions, but in the background, there was a quiet anticipation building, not the kind that rushes you, but the kind that waits patiently, knowing its moment is coming. Thursday arrived faster than I expected. The office was calm that morning, the usual rhythm of work filling the space. My assistant handed me the schedule. Olivia's name was third on the list, 11:30 a.m. I nodded and continued with the first 2 interviews. Both professional, both routine, nothing unusual. But as the clock moved closer to 11:30, I noticed something change in my focus. Not nerves, not uncertainty, just awareness. Like standing at the edge of something you've been walking toward for years without realizing it. At 11:28, there was a soft knock on the door. My assistant stepped in. "Your next candidate is here," she said. I closed the file in front of me and straightened slightly in my chair. "Send her in," I replied calmly. The door opened a few seconds later, and there she was, Olivia. Dressed exactly as I expected, confident, composed, carrying herself with the same certainty she always had. She stepped into the room without hesitation, her eyes scanning the space briefly before landing on me. And in that exact moment, everything stopped. Not in the room, but between us, because for the first time, the reality she had built about me collided with the truth standing right in front of her. And I watched it happen in real time. The shift in her expression, the slight pause in her movement. The way her confidence didn't disappear, but cracked just enough to let something else through, something she wasn't prepared for. And I realized then that this moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about something much simpler, much quieter. It was about truth finally arriving without needing to be announced. And she was sitting right in front of it. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. The air in the room felt still, like everything had paused just long enough for the moment to settle into reality. Olivia stood there, her hand still lightly holding the edge of the chair in front of my desk, as if she hadn't fully decided whether to sit or not. Her eyes stayed on me, searching, recalculating, trying to understand what she was seeing. Because this didn't match the version of me she had carried in her mind for years. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I simply gestured toward the chair and said calmly, You can sit, my voice steady, neutral. The same tone I had used in every other interview that morning. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before sitting down. Her movements controlled but not as effortless as before. She placed her folder on the table. Though we both knew I already had her resume in front of me for a moment. She tried to return to familiarity, to routine. I didn't know this was your company, she said. Her voice carrying a careful balance between surprise and composure. I nodded slightly. I didn't think you would, I replied, keeping my expression unchanged. Another small silence followed, heavier this time. Not uncomfortable but undeniable. The kind that forces truth to sit between two people without distraction. She straightened her posture slightly, adjusting back into what she knew best. Confidence, structure, control, well, she said, allowing a faint smile to return. This is unexpected. But I'm here for the operations manager role. I assume you've reviewed my application. I glanced down briefly at the file, then back at her. I have, I said, opening it slowly, deliberately, not to create tension, but simply because there was no need to rush anything anymore. The moment itself was already doing all the work. Your experience is solid, I continued. Strong background, consistent growth, good leadership exposure, she nodded, visibly regaining some of her confidence as we moved into familiar territory. Thank you, she said, her tone more natural now. I've worked hard to get here. I paused for a moment, letting her words settle, then closed the file gently, placing my hand on top of it and looked directly at her. Can I ask you something? I said. She nodded without hesitation, of course. I held her gaze for a second longer before speaking. What do you consider a real job? The question landed differently than anything else in the room. I saw it immediately, the slight tightening in her expression. The way her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Because this wasn't part of the interview script she expected, she let out a small breath. As if buying herself a moment, a real job? She repeated, her tone lighter than the tension underneath it. I'd say something stable. Structured, something that creates measurable impact. I nodded slowly. And something that makes money? I added, not as a challenge, but as a continuation. She gave a small, almost automatic smile. Well, of course. That's part of it. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair. My voice still calm, still even. You used to ask me that a lot, I said. Not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact. Her eyes dropped for a brief second before returning to mine, this time without the same certainty. Ava, she started, but stopped herself. As if unsure how to continue, I didn't interrupt, I didn't push. I simply let the silence exist, because this wasn't about forcing a moment. It was about allowing it to unfold naturally. She exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. I didn't realize. She began, but again, the sentence didn't finish. Because now she understood. Not just where she was sitting, but what it meant. The years of comments, the assumptions, the quiet dismissals. All of it now placed in a different context. I reached for the file again, opening it just enough to slide a paper out. Then placed it gently on the table between us, not dramatically, not forcefully. Just enough for her to see. Her eyes moved down to the page, scanning it quickly at first, then slower, more carefully. The numbers were clear, revenue reports, growth projections, team structure, the kind of information that doesn't need explanation. I watched her expression change, not dramatically, but undeniably. The confidence she had walked in with didn't disappear. It shifted, reshaped itself into something quieter. Something more grounded, something real. She looked back up at me. Her voice softer now. This is yours? She asked, and for the first time in the entire conversation, there was no performance in her tone. No edge, no comparison, just a simple question. I nodded. Yes, I said, nothing more. Because nothing more was needed, another silence followed. But this one felt different from the others. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't tense, it was clear. Like something had finally settled into place. She leaned back slightly in her chair, processing everything, and for a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in her before. Not confidence, not control, but reflection. I was wrong, she said quietly, almost to herself, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anything she had said in years. I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't hear her, but because I didn't need to rush to fill that space either. After a few seconds, I closed the file again and folded my hands on the desk. This interview isn't about the past, I said calmly, bringing the focus back to where it belonged. It's about whether you're the right fit for this role. She nodded slowly, understanding the shift, the professionalism of it, the boundary. We continued the interview after that, discussing strategy, leadership, decision-making. And for the first time, the conversation between us felt balanced. Not because everything had changed, but because the truth was now part of the room. When the interview ended, she stood up, holding her folder a little tighter than before. "Thank you," she said, "and this time." The words felt genuine. I nodded. "We'll be in touch," I replied. Maintaining the same calm tone, she turned toward the door, then paused for a brief second as if considering something, before walking out without saying anything more. The door closed softly behind her, and just like that, the moment was over. But something about it stayed, not in the room, but in me, because I realized then that I had never needed to prove anything to her, or to anyone else. Not through words, not through arguments, not through explanations. The work had done that on its own, quietly, consistently, without asking for attention, and in the end, the same job she once laughed at, the one she called small, the one she believed would never become anything, was the very place she walked into, hoping for an opportunity. And as I sat there, looking at the closed door, one thought settled clearly in my mind. The difference between us was never about talent or opportunity. It was about perspective, because while she was busy judging what she could see, I was building something she never took the time to understand. And the day she finally saw it, it was no longer something she could stand above. It was something she had to reach for.